Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I have a small technical note to start with. There are earphones for people who would like interpretation and translation. They are at the back of the room, is that right? In the just out there. I'm actually just amazed at the turnout for this wonderful evening. I shouldn't be surprised because of how distinguished our guest is, but it's always wonderful to see a packed hall and to see such a diverse group and to know that there's so many here who have come from not just around Ottawa, but from a great distance to hear our speaker and to take part in our conference. My name is Barbara McDougall. I'm the chairman of the board of the International Development Research Center. And as you may have heard, this year IDRC celebrates its 40th anniversary. We were founded in 1970, and since then we have moved nonstop in the field that we're talking about tonight. But when we were born, we, the IDRC, the circumstances were particularly auspicious. When the act launching IDRC was passed by Parliament in 1970, the roll call was unanimous. One can hardly imagine a more ringing endorsement, and certainly a very unusual event on Parliament Hill. Not just in these days, but in those days. But IDRC deserved that vote of confidence in the beginning, and it still does today. It has pursued its mandate to foster research for development with vigor and with imagination. And our projects and our work have been well received all over the world. To kick off its fifth decade, IDRC is eager to highlight the lasting impacts of the scientific and technical knowledge that it has helped to create. And thus, this important lecture series, which we are calling Speakers of Renown. During the year, IDRC will host some of the best minds in international development. Among them are South African politician Trevor Manuel, Jordanian economist and politician Rima Khalaf-Hunaldi, and Canadian historian Margaret McMillan. These speakers of renown will give free public lectures on a wide range of pressing issues. We like to sum up the speakers in this series this way. They are brilliant. They're changing the world, and they're giving free lectures. That's the part we like the best. This evening we're presenting the first talk in the series, and fittingly its subject matter spans the entire history of IDRC. When the organization was founded, the world was worried about the threat of famine, and so IDRC's prime focus was agricultural research to alleviate hunger. Throughout the 1970s, IDRC helped launch the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, as well as other innovative networks dedicated to issues like cropping and agroforestry. To this day, IDRC persists in its focus on agriculture. In 2009, responding to the most recent global food crisis, IDRC and CETA jointly launched a $62 million Canadian International Food Security Research Fund to study issues like crop resilience, the nutritional value of crops, and infectious diseases related to crops and animal production. Thus, we are proud to host the distinguished Ethiopian-American agronomist, Dr. Gebisa Ejeta. He will speak to us on the topic Revitalizing Agricultural Research for Global Food Security. Very topical indeed. Last year, Dr. Ejeta was honored for developing varieties of drought-resistant crops and also for his tireless efforts to ensure that farmers received improved seed. For this work, he was awarded the World Food Prize, which is considered the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for Agriculture. IDRC was an early supporter of Dr. Ejeta's research. It funded his research for ways to protect crops against the scourge of the parasitic weed striga, known as witchweed. And if I may insert a quick note on how this evening will unfold, please note that after Dr. Gebisa speaks, he will take questions from you in the room, and the question and answer session will be moderated by IDRC's Vice President, Program and Partnership, Rohinton Medora. Before Dr. Ejeta himself comes to the podium, however, we're going to present a short video about his life and work, courtesy of the World Food Prize Foundation.
On a late summer day at Purdue University, Dr. Gebisa Ejeta roams the fields of the world's leading sorghum research program. Sorghum, one of the world's 5 principal cereal grains, is a major source of food, fuel, and material. Tracing its origins to Africa, it is a crop of unparalleled importance to hundreds of millions of people. The story of our laureate also begins in Africa, in the hills of west-central Ethiopia. Born in the village of Wolonkomi, Gebisa Ejeta was raised in a one-room thatched hut by illiterate parents and learned very early of life's hardships.
In my household, in as much as I had lots of love because of the limited income, life was a struggle on a daily basis. So hunger is something that I have personally experienced.
Gebisa's mother, Motu Ayano, was determined that her son would have a different future. She made a series of sacrifices to provide an education for her only child. When a school opened in the village, she scraped together the funds to enroll Gebisa.
Of all the people that have made a difference in my life, she is the most important.
He continued his schooling in a neighboring town 20 kilometers away.
This is a road that we travel on every Sunday. And we first walk about 15 kilometers, and the last 5 kilometers is really a killer road because from here on is all the way uphill, all the way to the school.
Finishing 8th grade at the top of his class, Gebisa was selected to study at Jimma Agricultural and Technical School, where he graduated with distinction. He then entered Alamaya College. He excelled not only in the classroom, but on the basketball court as well, eventually earning a position on the Ethiopian national team. He intended to study agricultural engineering until a meeting with the head of the plant sciences department, Brahani Gebrakidan, changed his plans.
He had just come back after completing his PhD at University of Minnesota. And so just about a year before he got back to Ethiopia, he had heard of Noam Borlaug's Nobel Prize. And so he used that as an incentive to tell me the opportunities that one will have in studying plant sciences.
Shortly after obtaining his plant science degree from Alamaya, it would be a scientist from another university in the American Midwest that would dramatically alter the course of his life. Purdue professor and noted sorghum researcher John Axtell was collecting sorghum species throughout Ethiopia when Gebisa was invited to join him. Dr. Axtell was so impressed with the young man that he offered him a place in his graduate program. Gebisa accepted and in 1974 enrolled at Purdue. As his research continued there, political unrest was breaking out back home.
And there was a civil war in the country in several directions, and I was advised not to return to Ethiopia.
Despite the warnings, Gebisa returned briefly in 1976 to marry his wife, Sanait. The two would go on to raise 5 children together, but would not return to their homeland for another 2 decades. After completing his doctorate in 1978, he was offered a position heading ICRISAT's sorghum breeding program in Sudan. It was here he would achieve his first major breakthrough. Within 5 years, Dr. Ejeta had developed Africa's first sorghum hybrid, a drought-tolerant variety able to withstand Sudan's drylands. While the hybrid, dubbed Hajin Dura 1, showed tremendous potential for increasing yields, Dr. Ejeta knew that to effect real change, he would have to persuade local farmers of the seed's value. The demonstrated superior qualities of Hajin Dura 1 led to wide acceptance by farmers and yield increases of up to 150%. With funding from USAID, Dr. Ejeta then set out to create a national seed production and distribution system, which led to an explosion of the commercial seed industry. Thousands of Sudanese farmers have now harvested over 1 million acres of Hajin Dura 1, and more than a dozen seed companies are operating throughout the country. Yet despite the success of the drought-tolerant hybrid, sorghum growers in Sudan and throughout Africa were still experiencing devastating losses from an old foe, the parasitic plant Striga. Commonly known as witchweed, Striga is estimated to cause crop losses of up to 40% of Africa's total cereal harvest. The parasite inflicts most of its damage while hidden underground and can lie dormant in the soil for up to 20 years, rendering traditional control methods ineffective.
By the time the Striga plants emerged above ground, it had already spent weeks parasitizing the host plant, and so the damage has already been done. Trying to control the Striga through hand hoeing and cultivation is really an exercise in futility.
When Ejeta returned to Purdue to accept a faculty research position, he was determined to battle this scourge. Working with his colleague Larry Butler, Dr. Ejeta devised a novel approach to unravel the complex biochemical relationship between the parasitic weed and the host sorghum plants.
By breaking it down to simple components, the components of germination, hostorial production, attachment of the rootlets, and then subsequent stages of defense responses that are being generated. Being able to examine those separately, we were able to break down this complex problem into individual components that are attackable then one by one.
After 9 years, Drs. Ejeta and Butler developed the world's first Striga-resistant sorghum. Despite the magnitude of the scientific achievement, Dr. Ejeta knew it wasn't enough. The varieties had to reach African farmers. In 1994, working with USAID and World Vision, Drs. Ejeta and Butler produced 8 tons of Striga-resistant seed for 12 African countries. They organized farmer education workshops and trained agronomists on management and distribution. The improved Striga-resistant cultivars produced dramatic results, increasing yields by as much as 4 times over local varieties. In 2003, Dr. Ejeta established an integrated Striga management project in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Tanzania that emphasized combining the new varieties with water conservation and fertilization. Working with leaders and farmers across sub-Saharan Africa and educational institutions in the U.S. and abroad, Dr. Ejeta has strengthened agricultural networks and personally trained a new generation of scientists. His accomplishments have inspired countless others throughout Africa, especially in his native country. On a recent visit to his village in Ethiopia, the man who was once a national hero on the hardwood was hailed as a returning hero of humanity by hundreds of well-wishers.
The fact that someone from that village had gotten to be recognized on a global scale, and that their small village was being put on a map, so to speak, they really took that with a great sense of pride.
Dr. Ejeta's journey has taken him from the humblest of beginnings to the pinnacle of acclaim.
This year, the World Food Prize is awarded to a man whose work is not confined to a single field, but covers several. From the science of plant genetics to the creation of thriving local markets to the training of farmers in new agricultural techniques.
His scientific discoveries have been revolutionary, but he has also served as a voice of the poor, working tirelessly to ensure that the benefits of his breakthroughs reach those who need them most. His dedication to that purpose has dramatically improved millions of lives throughout Africa and has earned Gebisa Ejeta the 2009 World Food Prize.
As you can see, among other things, he's very tall. Mesdames, Messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to introduce to you Dr. Gebisa Ejeta.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you also for inviting me to be here with you tonight and to make me speaker of the inaugural celebration of the 40th anniversary of IDRC. I must confess from the outset that as you heard, the first job I held out of graduating out of college was with IDRC in an IDRC-supported sorghum improvement project that my college mentor, Dr. Berhane Gebrakidan, was awarded. And so he recruited me and 3 other young men, 4 of us. We worked there for a year, and all 4 were admitted to prestigious universities in Canada. 3 of them came over to Canada, and as you indicated in the story that was told, a chance encounter with John Axtell from Purdue University suggested that I gave up going to University of Alberta and ended up at Purdue University. So I'm actually a defector. But thank you very much for not holding that against me. Let me premise my talk with this comment, because you would see as I begin to talk, I may get a little more passionate about these issues. And so I want to confess ahead of time and that my whole life, particularly my professional life, is based on 2 major life's experiences that I've had. One is the story that you heard on this documentary about growing poor in Ethiopia. And that has given me a lesson so valuable to me that I had remained true to the cause of using skills and experiences that I gained to serve humanity. So no pretense, that is based on this lifetime commitment. Long before anybody knew me, I had tried to live that life. And secondly, the kind of education I had received. Starting in high school to college to graduate education. My education is in the College of Agricultural Systems, particularly this concept of the land-grant university model that I may speak a little about. And this is the idea of educating young men and women so they would get an education and use that education to either conduct research or involved in the so-called tripartite function of an agricultural system. And that is to educate, to do research, and take the results of research to the communities that need them badly. And so this lesson has been inculcated in me throughout my education. And therefore, in the science that I conduct, in the experiment and research that I conduct, in the results I obtain, I had tried to remain true to that. So my professional career and my personal dedication and determination along those lines is based out of these two experiences. So if I get a little passionate as I speak, I want you to excuse me based on this understanding of where I come from. And so as it was told, the title of my talk is Revitalizing Agriculture Research for Global Food Security. Nearly everyone that is connected to agriculture or studied agriculture either in the United States or Canada would acknowledge that advances made in the agricultural sciences helped build the economies of Canada and the United States, making 20th century North American agriculture very successful. In the United States, we believe that the U.S. land-grant university model, promulgated by the Morrill Act of 1862, was the genesis of this imaginative agricultural experience. This legislation offered the vision that such universities would adopt a tripartite function of agricultural education, agricultural research, and agricultural extension as the key essentials of science-based development. It was envisioned that these universities would provide segments of society with practical and timely education that would be useful to their daily lives. In other countries, including Canada, where modern agriculture succeeded, a similar division of labor among the three functions were designed in a slightly different arrangement. Nevertheless, a profound concept based on a system that focused on educating the next generation of agricultural sciences, providing support to the generation of new knowledge and technology, and communicating the results of these new discoveries to key holders was born. So to reiterate from a brief comments that I already made, and to perhaps build some anticipation for my talk, my thesis is this, that a 19th century wisdom in the land-grant university model resulted in a remarkable 20th century agricultural revolution in North America, but unfortunately also led to the 21st century complacency and neglect of agricultural sciences and practice. And if uncorrected, I suggest that it will exacerbate the concerns of global food security. I'll try to build this up. Over the last century, the North American agricultural sector became the most productive and envy of the world. Its successes expanded into Western Europe, and together, the people of the so-called free world have become accustomed to a safe and relatively inexpensive supply of food. As you may all know, the North American agricultural revolution was brought about primarily by the discovery of the genetic basis of hybrid vigor and the allied sciences, but also by the advent of the commercial hybrid corn technology that gave rise to the private seed industry and the associated complex of business, services, and partnerships. In other words, an emergence of a successful model for public-private partnership was born. Away from the developed world scenario, the success of science-based development in agriculture spurred the advent of the Green Revolution, converting some nations from basket case to bread baskets. The architect of this revolution was the late Norman Borlaug, a hero to me and many others. I believe the transformative change brought about by modern agriculture sciences in his native Iowa inspired Norman Borlaug to dream about helping the poor in developing countries overcome hunger with the breakthroughs he achieved in wheat genetics. He saw how the advent of hybrid corn and private sector initiatives with the seed industry and other agribusinesses spurred not only productivity increases on farm, but also enhanced the livelihood of both rural and urban Americans. The Asian Green Revolution transformed agriculture initially into Mexico, India, and Pakistan, expanding later into Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Philippines, and so on. The successful venture to eradicate, reduce hunger, and reduce rural poverty in these densely populated regions of the world was made possible through the agricultural sciences again. But it would have remained just another brilliant research finding and an end unto itself in the absence of sustained investments of governments and foundations in agricultural education, agricultural research, agricultural extension, and in building infrastructure and the support of local governments for credits and markets for inputs and outputs. But the Green Revolution missed Africa. I believe that the primary reason why Africa missed out is that while the Asian Green Revolution was being launched in the 1960s, independent Africa was just being born. Much of the human capacity and the institutional infrastructure essential for an agricultural revolution in Africa was very weak and non-existent. At the end of the World War and into the mid-1960s, just after the flurry of newly independent African nations, few Africans earned graduate degrees in the agricultural sciences. Very little functional science infrastructure existed across our continent. The vestiges of the few entities left behind by colonial leaders had no substantive research programs aligned with Africa's national development. The colonial agricultural research farms were no more than test stations of commodities of European interest, such as cotton, coffee, tea, and cocoa. Unfortunately, even when these budding research programs expanded into field crops and livestock, the lack of human capacity meant that the scope of this research remained very limited. Furthermore, the discoveries of the miracle crop varieties that ignited the Asian Green Revolution were in rice and wheat, very important global crops for sure, but they were not really in sorghum, in millet, in maize, or cassava, the true staff of life for Africans. The colonial agricultural research, furthermore, the discoveries of the miracle crop varieties that ignited the Asian Green Revolutions were in these crops. In general, however, Africa was simply not ready for science-based development campaign at the time. As a result, sub-Saharan Africa remains the only region in the world where hunger and poverty prevail. I don't need to bore you with the statistics. Today, the world laments that some 1 billion people, nearly 1/6 of the world's population, suffer from chronic hunger. Some 25,000 people die each day from malnutrition. Sadly, for these very poor 1 billion, any emerging food crisis becomes a chronic and permanent problem, not a temporary situation that can easily exit when the global economic recession shows signs of recovery or the per barrel price of oil declines. Global hunger is a moral issue and a fundamental problem too big to ignore. It limits the potential of individuals, communities, and nations for generation. It also undermines all other development investments by and on behalf of poor nations. The political and social stability of all nations, poor and rich, can be compromised by national, regional, and global hunger. Unfortunately, the fact remains that the success of science of agriculture and modern agricultural enterprises in the developed world led to the unfortunate complacency and neglect of agriculture. Farming became a profitable undertaking in the developed world, where breakthroughs in the science of agriculture dramatically transformed production practices and increased farming efficiency. It drew great investments from both rural and urban businesses. Crop yield levels reached record heights. Income grew, and food prices declined. An unfortunate result of this was that society began to take agriculture for granted. In light of the pressing need for public support of other societal needs, securing public funding for agriculture and agricultural sciences became difficult. Interestingly, the private sector in the rich nations was investing heavily in agriculture, particularly in the area of biotechnology, focusing on weed and insect control, but at the same time that public funding was dwindling for the broader area of production agriculture and natural resource management. In the developing countries, although hunger still prevailed and rural poverty was growing rampant, the decline in public funding for agriculture in the developed world also carried over to their foreign assistance of agriculture. The decrease in foreign assistance created a further decline in public spending by the governments of developing countries, instead of increasing to compensate for the loss of foreign aid. Sadly, The surplus production in the developed world was perceived as a solution to the shortages in developing countries. As a result, food aid became the biggest instrument of intervention to address the problem of food shortages in developing countries. I acknowledge the importance of food aid. It saves life, but I was talking about the long-term implications of development in developing countries. So that's how agricultural sciences had become a victim of its own success. The decline in public funding in agricultural sciences, both here and abroad, led to less and less scientific interventions to advance production agriculture and more to address the emerging problems of natural resources and the environment. We know that rural hunger and poverty decline dramatically when education, investment, and new technologies give farmers access to better ways to be productive. This happened in Europe and North America in the middle decades of the 20th century, then in Japan, and then on the irrigated lands of East and South Asia during the Green Revolution in the final decades of the 20th century. The recent food price crisis may have served as a badly needed rude awakening, however. A series of global events led to this rude awakening. The initial shock may have come from the general agreement by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that the warming trend felt in the last few years will continue, and left unchecked may endanger hundreds of millions of the poor in developing countries as early as 2020. The potential problems arising from climate change in terms of worsening food and water shortages in regions of the world where the poor dwell are huge. This is particularly true in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, aggravating the growing pressure on land, water, and food supplies as disheartening developments. The global economic recession and skyrocketing cost of energy around the world made things worse as higher energy prices directly drove up the cost of agricultural inputs, such as inorganic fertilizers, insecticides, and pesticides. Farmers in the developed world were able to work around the nexus because credit was still available, though tight. But the ability of small farmers in developing countries to respond to the incentive of higher food prices through increased production was much more limited. Furthermore, the 2008 food price crisis showed us that global food shortages could bring about disruptions in life that would resonate to the far fringes of the planet. We realized that we were not as food awash as we once thought we were. Families in the United States and Western Europe felt the effects, as did the masses in developing countries, but with dire consequences. It became evident that without the general balance between food demand and supply, to which we've been accustomed to, food scarcity and volatility of food prices will pose a critical risk of global food security. To avert disaster and more surprises, I believe a revitalized agricultural research is badly needed. This is true both for the national agricultural research systems of the developing countries, the international agricultural research centers that support the NARS, as well as the public and private research infrastructure that responds to the needs of the developed world, including the more affluent economies of Canada and the United States. In spite of its proven success, public investment in agricultural research have dramatically declined in recent years. U.S. funding of national agricultural research institutions of developing countries, for example, has declined by 75% in the 1980s. U.S. support for the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, the leading network of international research centers responsible for innovations in agriculture production system useful to poor farmers in the developing world, has been cut by about 47%. And its funding for collaborative research support between American and developing country institutions dropped by 55%. And you could probably have similar comparable numbers in Canadian support to agricultural research, both here and abroad. I believe in 2009, a confluence of ideas emerged, called for was an end to complacency and revitalization of agricultural research, focused on alleviating hunger and energizing science-based development. Among the first voices that emerged on the topic was one that came through an excellent report developed by the Chicago Council for Global Affairs. Many of us made what we thought were compelling arguments for renewing attention to agriculture in U.S. development policy, calling for increased support in agricultural education, research, and extension, both in the United States and abroad. We argued for research support at multiple levels, including domestic institutions, national programs in developing countries, and the international agricultural research centers. The second major initiative on the positive note that arrived to appear was a new U.S. government bill. This bill seeks to reorient U.S. foreign assistance to focus on hunger and poverty and to help counter the threat that global food crisis will emerge. As many of you would know, in July 2009, the G8 summit, global leaders pledged more than $20 billion to support a renewed global effort towards food security. In addition to the financial commitments, global leaders established principles to follow. These included use of a comprehensive approach, investment in country-led plans, local, regional, and global coordination, involvement of multilateral institutions, and delivery of accountable commitments. Historically, the United States and Canada have been among the leaders in international development assistance in poor countries. Numerous developing countries have received substantial foreign assistance from both U.S. and Canada in such a diverse pattern of technical assistance, ranging from human capacity building, institutional strengthening, major infrastructure development efforts, to a variety of community development programs. Unfortunately, both the USAID and CEDA and IDRC included have substantially reduced their development assistance portfolio in the last couple of decades, unfortunately at a time when the need out there grew. So these new resurgence of interest to commit more resources to national agriculture research even in the developed countries, as well as expanding foreign assistance, hopefully to include capacity building and institutional strengthening, is a timely investment. Let me mention this in passing. Institution building has been a hallmark of the International Development Research Center, IDRC of Canada. Long before the currently emerging advocacy for country-led technical assistance programs that I mentioned, IDRC had pioneered the development assistance program that held local programs as central entity to their foreign investments in agriculture development program. I was exposed to this IDRC model as a young college graduate entering the professional world for the first time. My first job, as I told you, from college was in IDRC-funded sorghum research project at Alama University in Ethiopia. The IDRC model was based on finding the best local talents, providing them with modest resource support, good mentoring and encouragement, and challenging them to take up the task of addressing a major mission-oriented research and development. The justifiable assumption was that local folks know their problems, and with proper and appropriate assistance and solid education, they could design practical solutions that address local needs far more effectively than most foreign experts. I express my thanks again to IDRC for that education and great wisdom. Let me also add the following somewhat in passing, that support for new and replacement of the rapidly aging and diminishing human capacity and invigorating their R&D infrastructure in developing countries remain a priority need for poor developing countries. I recently visited in Nairobi, Kenya, a newly refurbished regional biotechnology laboratory in Nairobi, Kenya, the Biosciences for Eastern and Southern Africa, BECA, a facility that was established and built almost entirely with assistance of CEDA. I happened to visit the facility this past December, only exactly a week after Mr. Bill Gates walked through those hallways. I was pleasantly surprised to read in his annual letter the enthusiasm in which Mr. Gates acknowledged the CEDA-built laboratory as a center of excellence and great promise. You should be heartened by that. How am I doing for time? 10 minutes. All right. Let me talk about this revitalized agricultural research. And this revitalized agriculture research will face grand challenges. I'll make these rather quick comments on how and why we should fund and conduct the new generation of agricultural research that can address the emerging grand challenges. Agriculture's renewed status is to serve as a vital resource for the sustainability of human civilization and the stability of peace and prosperity in the world. This opening creates a remarkable opportunity for the agricultural sciences to build on a legacy of success. Science and technology must continue to evolve at an uninterrupted pace if they are to have the capacity to respond to emerging societal challenges. It goes without saying that sustained investment in science is a basic essential for a society. Nevertheless, in my view, it's critical that targeted investment be made in a purpose-driven manner. Societies that do not invest in revitalization of the agricultural sector, and in advancing the agricultural science are in danger of facing another round of cruel surprises when the next series of food and resource shortages come around. Our food and natural resources problems are also becoming more and more complex, with highly interconnected ramifications. Solutions to these problems will require us to develop a more encompassing global perspective with respect to the nature of the issues we address as scientists. The following list reflects the types of emerging challenges, the complexity of their nature, and the diversity of tools required to address them adequately. Let me just run them through the list. I may not have time to go through them one by one. One is the population, food, production, and natural resource nexus. Second is agriculture and global climate change. The third on my list is the agriculture energy nexus. And the fourth is the looming global water crisis. The fifth one I list as a potential challenge is defining a functional public-private partnership in agricultural research and development. The thesis that I'm developing in my thought process is this. We have been challenged in addressing the problems of hunger and poverty in developing countries, and our record in that area is mixed. We could list a number of issues as I tried to list from my perspective. But now, on top of the challenge that is we have already had, we have the additional dimensions of major issues: water shortages, energy demands, and the population pressure to natural resources, and so on, and climate change in particular. That our understanding of the ramifications of these additional so-called grand challenges is that they will have significant impact. And our listing of these grand challenges is also common across the board, meaning that I have worked with 3 different institutions in the last year. And these 3 institutions made up a list of the grand challenges that are emerging. The list may be different by 1 or 2, but by and large, the list is very similar. It would include these items that I mentioned. But our understanding of the models that predict climate change, for example, the nature of energy demands that arise and the shortages that accrue, and the continual pressure we get from our use of existing non-renewable energy resources, all of these have significant ramifications. And then as we take these challenges on how they would affect agriculture, our understanding and even smaller than what the potential effect is. For example, if we were to look at climate change and what we would need to do to adopt climate change, the research that needs to be done in that area is going to be very complex. And so we have made as much progress as we have in the past through narrow disciplinary research, which had provided the basic foundation upon which particularly the private sector had built up and developed products and technologies that deliver. But as these problems get complex, the kind of research that we do is going to be complex as well. So we may need a holistic approach to understanding these problems, and the methodologies and the tools for these research are not developed yet, suggesting to me that we better get started sooner in addressing these issues so that as the problems become real in 50 years, 60 years, or 100 years from now, and that at least we have the tools and the human capacity with the know-how to address these problems. Again, suggesting in return that those investments need to happen today and not after we have midway into the problems. Let me just use a couple of examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. The population of the world is currently hovering around 6 billion and is expected to increase to 9 or 10 billion by 2050. The population of some of the poorest regions, such as sub-Saharan Africa, is expected to more than double. The Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, of the United Nations has determined that Africa will need to triple its food production by 2050 to provide adequate food for an African population that will then reach 2 billion. This means that the global food production would probably need to at least double in the next 4 to 5 decades, a very tall order indeed. Furthermore, this badly needed increase in food production will have to be achieved via efficient vertical expansion of the yield gap and with more judicious use of chemical inputs so as not to aggravate the degradation of natural resources even further. In agriculture and climate change, climatologists are in general agreement that a significant amount of global climate change will occur over the coming decades. Greenhouse gas emissions from human activity will have profound impact on agriculture during the coming decades. Across most of the tropics, crop yields would be lower and less stable because of rising temperature, changing rainfall pattern, increased heat stress, as well as drought and flooding. Accelerated greenhouse gas emissions are raising the Earth's atmosphere, which causes frequent extreme weather patterns and shifting seasons, conditions potentially disastrous for agriculture. Erratic weather resulting from gradual climate change, coupled with increased demand from a growing global population and income growth, threatens global food security. Agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa, which already faces serious constraints, will be hit harder than in other regions. Many studies predict overall reduction on the order of 10 to 20% in the yields of Africa's key food crops within the next several decades. Some scientists warn that in particular places like Africa's dry Sahelian regions, production of even hardy crops like millet and sorghum could become impossible. There is a general consensus that investments in agricultural research for development of new crop varieties would be critical for successful adaptation, albeit the mode of research and the level of investment necessary have not been completely determined yet. Let me skip over my notes on agriculture and energy and looming global water crisis, and maybe I'll speak on the public-private partnership concept that I have in the Q&A, and conclude my comments with these remarks. A revitalization of the agricultural sciences is badly needed to avert another food crisis and to assure global food security. In a world where demand for food is rising, assuring local food security is vital if we have to have global peace and prosperity. However, reinvigorating the world food system will require earnest commitment and major changes in national and international policies. These include renewed support for the science of agriculture, science of natural resource conservation, and protection of the environment. We need more than a change in every federal framework supporting agriculture research. We need an infusion of federal funding to address the challenges facing us in food security and availability, preventing disruptions to food supplies, and managing agricultural and natural resource systems. The problems of agriculture are becoming increasingly complex, requiring more holistic and integrated approaches to solving them. Tackling these complex problems adequately calls for the mobilization of the talent needed, as well as the financial resources needed to support earnest efforts. Past investments in agricultural research have produced solutions for problems of yesteryears, and we are proud of that legacy. We need to embrace the emerging challenges. We have talented cadre that is eager to be mobilized to tackle these seemingly intractable problems of agriculture, natural resources, and the environment. But we need to rekindle in the new generation of scientists the sense of purpose espoused in the wisdom of the land-grant university model that I described at the start of my talk. I'm certain that with some rethinking, the available talent can be mobilized to effectively address these complex problems. New funding opportunities are emerging for catalyzing a revitalized global engagement in the agricultural sciences. If world leaders act on the recent pledges to boost support for global agriculture research and development, it will spark a new era. We will see new science-based solutions to problems of hunger, problems of natural resource conservation, and protection of the environment. I'm hopeful that obligations being made for international technical assistance will be met by concurrent commitment from national governments of domestic agriculture research, both in the US, Canada, and even developing countries. A revitalized agriculture research agenda with a holistic approach to sustainable growth in agriculture is the key to averting future food crises, dealing with the natural resource conservation, energy and water shortages, and adapting to climate change. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Dr. Ejeta, for giving us this panorama that wove together agriculture, history, and development, and reminding us so compellingly of the central role that research and long-term investments, persistent investments in finding solutions plays in getting us to where we would like to be, but where we are not quite yet. Dr. Ejeta has graciously agreed to take questions from all of you. We have about 15-ish minutes for questions. I would ask you to go to either of the two microphones and to identify yourself and also give us your affiliation, please. One other sort of note, I should alert you, it says here, that this event is being webcast live and it is being recorded for later broadcast on the internet so that your words and your picture will appear on the web. I'm not sure if that's meant to be an incentive or a disincentive, but that's the way it is. Let's start with you, ma'am.
Hello, my name is Andrea Wenham, and I'm an analyst at Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada. I'm very interested in your views specifically on issues related to biotechnology and genetically modified crops. You spoke very eloquently about the need to reinvest in agricultural research, and I was wondering what your views were specifically on the capacity for biotechnology to address some of these issues. As a bit of a follow-on for that, I'm also interested in whether or not you think that some of the discussion and discourse surrounding these new technologies in developed countries, sometimes controversy as we see in many EU countries, if that affects a willingness to invest funds towards research that's more focused to the developing world.
This is a greeting in Amharic. Dr. Ejeta, you shouldn't be sorry to have missed Alberta, because when I was at the African Development Bank, our short lists for staff and for consultants are mainly from Purdue University. Now let's go to business. Since the 60s, the first decade of development, Robert McNamara, who was president of the World Bank after being Defense Secretary, has focused on poverty alleviation. And for 13 years, he was president from 61 to 71, and I worked closely with him a couple of years at that time. His only concern was poverty alleviation agriculture. This persisted for some years, and then came the structural adjustment follies, and they stopped all this. But when we sit with decision makers or politicians, they tell us agriculture has taken a lot of money. Do you think that an organization like FAO, who was entrusted with all this, is well run? And I'm putting you this question for you. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Bruce Moore. I'm here in my individual capacity. I've recently retired from the United Nations, where I directed the International Land Coalition hosted in Rome, an alliance of farmers' organizations in the UN system working on the property rights of the poor. And from that perspective, I fully respect the importance of agriculture research, and would go on to say that it's a necessary but not necessarily a sufficient condition to overcome hunger and poverty. From my experience, systemic political interests and powerful elites often expropriate the benefits of agriculture and rural development investments. Furthermore, overcoming hunger needs to take into consideration the evidence that in many agroecological conditions, smallholders produce more food per unit of land than commercial agriculture. So against this background, my question is, what lessons can you share with us on how the results of further investments in research will be put into the hands of smallholders, and in the case of commercial agriculture, will not be expropriated by elites or transnational agribusiness?
Thank you. These are all excellent questions. Let me attempt the biotechnology question first. I had an interview this afternoon with a group and shared my views on that. So maybe you should wait and listen to that. My position is this. I really think the biotechnology debate has been misplaced. It's been a misplaced debate. It's a wasted debate because it created an unnecessary chasm between those that support the technology and those that don't care for the technology. But instead, what I hope would develop now is an argument to make a case for science. And that, regardless of even the subsequent question that came, I don't know of any society anywhere in the world that had developed its economy without developing its agriculture, and never did it, none did it without science. Science and technology is extremely essential. There is science that can solve currently available science that can solve problems of today, and there is science that is in the pipe stream that would be here to solve the problems of tomorrow. Biotechnology has a tremendous potential to solve problems that we can't solve with the science and technology that we have today. But it's going to require investment. And so trying to make an argument for that investment with making an argument that biotechnology is the savior of the world is a misplaced argument. I think biotechnology is a very important technology that needs investment, but the investments are going to be huge. Who is going to be investing in that technology? The private sector has not only defined the sector of agricultural problems that they would tackle through biotechnology, and they have very successfully done that. But the larger, grander problems of society that requires investments from public resources or private resources to biotechnology is not going to be made by aggrandizing biotechnology and talking to people who don't support biotechnology as enemies of the world. I think in developing countries, the problem that we have is none of our communities in Africa have developed a culture and mindset to look to science for solutions of their problem. That is what we need to promote. If those communities get their initial solutions from science, when that technology is available, they could even begin to make a case for investment in biotechnology so that the more intractable problems could be addressed through that. And so I have been really annoyed by a lot of the debate alongside of the biotechnology. It divided a community of people from with North America and Europe and Africa and the rest of the world, but also the implication that comes with it that says that if only Africa would develop and adopt biotechnology, all its problems would be lost. That's not true either. The paradigm shifts that had taken place in Africa, I have just recently written a paper lamenting the fact that Africa or developing countries never were given the chance to set their agendas, because for one thing, they never believed, the leaders never believed in the value of agriculture and agricultural sciences and never invested their own resources. And a lot of the agenda was being set by outside agencies. And the fact that those paradigms continually shift, not because it's the right thing to do, but it's probably the clever thing to do in making sure that support for these new initiatives that come. And so paradigm shifts that are taking place in many of our development programs have really avoided, and as a result of that, we never had good traction to give development pattern time so that we have found solutions. In other words, that the changing of the paradigms had given us the longevity that we needed in sustained effort to produce good results. But I would not dare answer the question of whether FAO has been a good organization or not. Again, similar to the debate about biotechnology and the debate about large-scale farmers, small subsistence farmers, and private sectors and multinationals, again, in my view, is a misplaced debate. I'm sorry to sound that authoritative, but just I'm expressing my own personal thoughts. And the reason is that, again, I really think there is no substitute to making science available, technology available to change lives of the people and livelihood. There is no substitute for building capacity and institutional infrastructure in developing countries so that these countries become able to use science to solve their problems. There is no substitute in getting policy interventions and committed leadership, executive commitment and leadership among the leaders of the poor developing countries to begin to believe on the value of science. Otherwise, any attempt to suggest that traditional societies, in particular African societies, can solve their problems without these science-based interventions is not something that I subscribe to. I'm sure you may not be suggesting that, but I think the multinationals, that's a dimension that I can take. To make a comparison, and just living through the experience that I lived, when the private sector was a mom-and-pop operation in Canada and the United States, I don't think agriculture in North America will have developed without the intervention of those private sector development, meaning that the agro-industry complex that created it provided this humongous incentive for science-based initiatives to take effect. The multinationals of today operate under a totally different paradigm. They are owned by stockholders, and stockholders want their profit tomorrow. And as a result, they're not likely to invest today with the hope of making money tomorrow. The private sector that developed Canadian agriculture, United States agriculture, the one I'm more familiar with, the pioneers and the DeKalbs and so on in the world, they were community activities, the community initiatives that really built up communities, because if the community did well, they knew they were also doing very well. And so as a result of the multinationals buying a lot of the companies, I know the seed companies very well, we have lost that touch with community. Having said that, I can't think of developing country agriculture to develop into a profitable enterprise where farmers are producing more than what they consume so that they would have the necessary resources to send their children to school and begin to invest in their communities and so on, without an involvement of a well-functioning private sector enterprise in developing countries as well. So I'm gung-ho on private sector, but I think it's private sector that has sensitivity to the needs of the community.
So let's take the 4 questions at the 3 microphones and then come back to you for one last round of responses. I'll start with the middle mic.
Thank you. My name is Sami Al-Hanawi, adjunct professor at Carleton University. I'm not in this field. I'm in information and communication technology. In general, there is always the misunderstanding in innovation between research and technology. Research is always ahead of technology. Technology is to get the research done today. I'm not sure about agriculture, but I think you must have passed through this. You touched this in answering the last question. But the dilemma in information and communications technologies is that research is always ahead of technology, except that the private sector is taking a large lead in the technology part. You mentioned that this is resolved in agriculture in the developing countries, Canada and the United States. How this can be done in the underdeveloped or developing countries? There will be a problem in doing this, and this has to be addressed, because technology is of today, research is of tomorrow. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Raul Ponce. I am an associate professor at Trent University and the Environmental and Resources Studies program and Department of Geography in Peterborough. I'm Mexican by birth, and as a Mexican student of agronomy, I witnessed the last part of the Green Revolution and what it did to the countryside in Mexico. The huge polarization that it created, by which the improved seed, fertilizer, and inputs that were the tenets of the Green Revolution became just an excuse to avoid a red revolution, which is where the country was heading in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. And one of the fundamental premises of the Green Revolution was, at least the way it was implemented in Mexico, in spite of CIMMYT being being placed in Mexico, near Mexico City, was that it forgot, it became a top-down approach and forgot completely the indigenous knowledge, which in Mexico is extremely rich, comes back from pre-Hispanic times, millennia of the Mayas, Aztecs, and Toltecs, who developed a number of agricultural techniques, and they were glossed over by the Green Revolution and completely not integrated within that. So create a great divide between the rich and the poor farmer, smallholder, but with great indigenous knowledge that could survive high productivity in small parcels. To get to my question, I know that we are facing, as you mentioned it, we're mentioning a nexus of high complexity of problems with climate change, with food security, with water resources scarce. My question is, how can we avoid in the next, assuming that we get people to listen and there is funding available for agricultural research, how can we avoid the mistake, as far as my perspective is concerned, of the Green Revolution as it was handed down in Mexico, for instance, and I don't know about other countries. How can we avoid that mistake of the top-down approach and take into consideration the richness of the indigenous knowledge in agriculture? After all, regimes come and go, philosophies come and go, and the farmers are still there. They have managed to survive, some of them in very small holdings. And with the complexity too, putting the complexity on top of the present environmental challenges that we're facing. Would you care then to comment on what kind of educational system do we need now to be facing the problems of 20, 30, 40 years from now? Thank you.
Tana Sterling. That means it's greeting in Ethiopia. My name is Samana. I work for the government of Canada, but I'm here on my personal capacity. Thank you very much for the beautiful presentation. Really, I'm very proud of you. But I've got a couple of questions for you. In my own opinion, one of the biggest challenges of agricultural or agrarian reform is because many of the African countries, I don't want to talk about any other Asian country, I would like to talk about Africa. They don't take agriculture as a major development agenda of their government. For example, if I give you China, despite all their communist upheavals since 1949, they have managed to feed 1.3 billion people without much ado. This is because they made agriculture and agrarian reform the core agenda of their government. Many may disagree because they are communist, but I think that's a fact. And when you go to Africa, and particularly of sub-Saharan Africa, you will see that many countries, they will prefer to invest in research for defense than they would like to invest on research on agriculture. And in such a situation, how do you expect that a green revolution will take in sub-Saharan Africa? And in particularly, many countries in the East. So this is the biggest challenge. As long as those governments in power in Africa don't make agriculture as a core agenda of their development program, whatever IDRC helps us, whatever USAID helps us, whatever SIDA helps us, may not do much result. And that is a challenge. And how do you answer to that? Thank you.
My name is Paul Slomp, and I'm here as a food policy analyst. I'm here as a farmer, and I'm here as someone who has worked with farmers on the Zambia-Malawi border for a long time. My question today has to do with with what mechanism do we set the priority for research in agriculture? And the reason I asked this question, I was just at a conference this past weekend in Guelph, the Guelph Organics Conference, and it was quite clear at that conference that that organic farmers in Canada and in North America are so far ahead of where the research is in organics that a lot of the practice that organic farmers are using on their farms is coming from other farmers using scientific method, but not from existing research channels. So with what mechanism do you suggest that we identify what gets researched and what does not?
The question on the distinction between research and technology. This is an agenda, an issue that is very, very close to my heart. we have had a discussion this afternoon, we touched on it, that you're absolutely right. Even in agriculture, there are research results, but they need to be converted into products and technologies that could be making a difference in the lives of people out on the farm. In the developed world, and that's the reason I mentioned the private sector coming up, allowing this opportunity of taking this profit motive-driven investment that was there to take the results of research and converting them into products and technologies to take them to farmers so the farmers would benefit. The intricate relationship that I am sensitive to is that the private sector trust that they built with farm communities is extremely important in those early days. The reason, if the farmer benefited, the growing private sector believed that's only when they can benefit. You can only sell seed to a farmer if that seed is not good, as long as they have a choice, they would go somewhere else. In developing countries, we have a problem. I said about poor infrastructure, poor institutions in developing countries, but you know as well as I do, perhaps, that the weakest institutions in developing countries is the private sector. In lieu of that, one would argue public-oriented service units such as extension service, seed distribution agencies, and so on. None of them had developed to the capacity that is required to deliver the services effectively in any of the African countries. There are countries that have invested significantly in these institutions. My own country is a good example, where they have gone out and trained 65,000 extension services, but yet the supported structure there is not there for these extension services to go out and deliver the products. So I'm a member of the Science Council in the International Research Center, and one of the things that I had taken was, how do you coordinate this movement all the way from in the line of research, from initial ideas to production of results to eventual product developments and eventually making a difference in the lives of the poor. How do you coordinate that? How do you create the division of labor among all the players such that there is a recognized body in every one of, or recognized bodies in every one of the countries that is given the responsibility to develop these technologies? Because I don't know how that is done, and there hasn't been a very good example how you could do that. And I think either you strongly fund a public institution and arm them to the best possible and do that, or you encourage private sector initiative to develop in a country and get it done that way. Other than that, there is a lot of talk about public-private partnerships of one kind or another. There are not very good examples. But the line of thinking in technology that you talked about exists in the agricultural sciences as well. And so paying particular attention on how you would convert the results of research to the potential products and technologies that would be utilized to make a difference in farm practices is a very, very essential idea that needs to be there. And thank you for the question. Polarization of the effect of green revolution, how you bring in the local knowledge of research. As an African that grew in farm communities, I have the utmost respect for indigenous knowledge. I'll give you an example. At Purdue University, we did research long before I got there, and they were conducting research, and the results were published only for a couple of Africans on the graduate student to tell them that this has been practiced by farm communities in Africa for a long time. And so there is a lot of knowledge base that is there. And the trick is how to marry that, and so that research communities develop a better understanding of what the knowledge base is in the local indigenous knowledge and bring that into the research agenda. But in my way of looking at it, that does not suggest the farmers know what is best, and therefore we shouldn't worry about it. I really think that marriage is extremely important to bring in the indigenous knowledge to the scientific method, and such that the results of what is coming out of there is one that has totally grasped the knowledge base in the indigenous community, and yet brought in the virtues and values of research science to solving that problem. Agriculture as a development agenda not taken seriously by leaders in Africa? Absolutely. I think that has been the main reason why we have not advanced our agriculture significantly, because we have not invested in the key nuggets that are required in human capacity, in building institutions, and putting the right sets of policy and conditions there. And instead, we became reliant on foreign assistance. And so this afternoon, we had an excellent discussion as a group at IDRC, where we talked about these interventions that have come out, and these interventions are invested in there. And so you go around any African country today, and you ask somebody on the street, and they would ask you where an IDRC program is, where a CEDA program is, where a USAID program is, where the GTZ program is, and so on. Where in reality, it shouldn't be that. It should be a national program. And the agenda needed to be set by, it should be country-led by the national programs. And then when CEDA comes in, or IDRC comes in, and that national program should have the gumption to say, sorry, we're not interested in what you have in mind. If you want to help us, this is where we want to be helped in. Whether or, how do you get that? And so the argument that I'm making at this moment is that the environment in Africa has changed. There is a lot more positive development in Africa, and that's why I like the theme of tomorrow's conference, because there is a lot of positive development in Africa, and we still continue to badmouth Africa on the basis of what we have known for the last 4 or 5 decades. And so instead, I beg you to take notice of the positive developments that have taken place, and then let us have the humility to change the game, the nature of the game. Let's play it differently from how we played it in the last 4 or 5 decades. And that is to have some respect for the local programs. Let these be country-led programs. And I remember at the World Food Prize, I had the privilege of meeting with Bill Gates. And I asked him, and in the question and answer that I sat and talked with him and said, here is an individual that has no political baggage. He is a philanthropist. Maybe I shouldn't say no, but compared to leaders of governments, he has no apparent baggage. And so I said, can you, and you and your wife and family, willing to sit down with national programs and begin to empower them and tell them that this should be about you, about your own initiative, and say, can you develop a national agenda for research and development? If you don't know how, what are the areas you need help to develop that? And we'll provide you with the experts. And then you sit down and set the national agenda and national priorities. Not only that, be bold enough to put your own meager resources front and center into that investment to begin with. So you are responsible for that program. And where you need help, go out and ask help from these agencies that are coming. Until that happens, whether it is setting an agenda or the priority setting for research agenda that a questioner wrote around here, is going to be a shifting target, a moving target that would change depending on the climate of getting assistance from the donor agencies. And so eventually, I think about the only way we could get traction on the ground and to really have sustainable development in agriculture or in economic development in African countries is when these African countries own up to the issue of the need to invest and the need to embolden and empower their own people. And I'm not diverting, but let me say this. I provided a testimony in the front of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee last March, and I wasn't sure how to put this to them. And so I wasn't sure if I insulted them, but I said, I liken this technical assistance program and the large number of cadre of agencies coming from outside providing advice on how these countries need to change to the weight gain recommendations that we get. There are, we have so many NGOs going around the country. Many of them are well-meaning. But imagine the large number of NGOs and development agencies from foreign countries that are roaming around these countries. And so how do you expect to orchestrate all of that towards a meaningful change? And so I likened it to these weight gain diet companies. Many of them are good. Some of them are worthless, right? But in each one of those, there is something that would work. But in most of them, a lot of it doesn't work, right? But eventually, whether or not you get sustainable change in that advice you get is only when you, the advice taker, have the discipline to take that up and practice it on a sustainable change your diet and have some discipline and exercise regularly, and only then that would take it. And so it is the same in development assistance. You can have all kinds of people come and give you advice. The only way that you can have sustainable change on the ground is if you empower the citizenry on the ground, and they own up to the cause. And we need to do that. I'm sorry, I got sidetracked here.
So thank you. IDRC was created in 1970. Dr. Ejeta received his first grant from IDRC in 1973. So we feel so absolutely thrilled and privileged that we have someone who not only represents and spans the IDRC era, but embodies its ethos and its way of doing things with us to kick off this speaker series. So thank you for that. Not content with having practically exploited you all day today, Dr. Ejeta did mention a conference tomorrow and the day after. This is a conference called Africa's New Frontier, Innovation, Technology, Prosperity that IDRC and the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade are co-hosting. It's going to be held at the Chateau Laurier Hotel, Thursday and Friday. Donc, nous sommes très heureux également que vous avez accès.
So we're delighted that you've also accepted to take part in tomorrow's conference at the Chateau Laurier Hotel under the theme, The New Africa Frontier, Innovation, Technology, and Prosperity.
This event, as well as tomorrow and day after's event, will be posted soon on the IDRC website, so by all means take a look there. Thank you, all of you, for having joined us this evening. Thank you again, Dr. Ejeta, for having joined us as well and inspired us for so many decades and no doubt for so many more decades to come.
Thank you very much.